Hi guys, today I'm going to read to you the next chapter of Nancy Drew, The Secret of the Old Clock. We're going to be reading chapter 9, which is called Helpful Disclosures. Nancy watched Abby Rowan intently as the mantel clock finished striking. The elderly woman's lips had begun to move. "The clock," she whispered. That was it, the clock. Nancy gripped the arms of her chair in excitement. "Josiah hid the will in a clock?" she prompted. No, it wasn't that," Abby muttered, sighing again. "I know Josiah said something about a clock, but whatever it was has slipped my mind." Silence descended the room. Nancy was wondering what connection the timepiece would have to the missing will. Mrs. Rowan was staring at the clock, evidently trying to probe her memory. Suddenly she gave a low cry. "There! It came to me just like that." "What, Mrs. Rowan?" Nancy urged quietly, lest she startled the old woman into forgetfulness. "A notebook!" Abby exclaimed triumphantly. Nancy's heart gave a leap, but she forced herself to say calmly, "Please tell me more about this notebook." "Well, one day not long before he passed away, Josiah said to me, 'Abby, after I'm dead, if my last will isn't found, you can learn about it in this little book of mine.' Do you know what became of the notebook, Mrs. Rowan?" "Oh, dearie me, there goes my memory again. No, I don't." Although baffled, Nancy felt a growing conviction that the whereabouts of a Crowley will was definitely tied up with a clock of some kind. But she pondered, why did the striking of the mantel clock remind Abby Rowan of the notebook? Impulsively, Nancy got up and went over to the mantel. She looked inside the glass front and then the back. There were no papers inside. Returning to her chair, Nancy asked the elderly woman what became of the furnishings of the Crowley home when he gave it up. The Tophams got most everything." "There must have been a family clock," Nancy mused to herself. "A family clock," Abby repeated. "Oh, yes, there was a clock." "Can you describe it?" "It was an ordinary mantel type, something like mine, tall with a square face," the woman told Nancy, "only Josiah's was fancier. It had some kind of a moon on top." "What became of the clock?" Nancy questioned. "I suppose the Tophams got that too." At last, Nancy, sure she had done all she could for Abby, and she had learned as much as possible for the present, she rose to depart. After saying goodbye, she stopped at a neighboring house and asked the occupants to look in occasionally on the ailing woman. "I think maybe one of the county's visiting nurses should see Mrs. Rowan," she suggested. "I'll phone the agency," the neighbor offered. "Meanwhile, I'll go over myself. I'm so sorry I didn't know about Mrs. Rowan." As Nancy drove toward River Heights, she jubilantly reviewed the new facts in the case. "Now, if only I can locate Mr. Crowley's notebook, or the clock, or both." Nancy's brow knit in concentration. How would she go about tracking the old timepiece? "I guess," she concluded, "if the Tophams do have the clock, I'll have to pay them a visit." While she did not relish the idea of calling on the unpleasant family, Nancy was determined to pursue every possible clue. "I can just see Ada and Isabel's expressions when I appear at their front door," Nancy thought wryly. "Well, I'll think of some excuse to see them." She was still mulling over the problem when she pulled into the driveway of her home and heard a familiar voice calling her name. "Why, Helen Corning," Nancy exclaimed as a slim, attractive school friend of hers ran up. "I haven't seen you for days." "I've been busy lately," Helen explained, "trying to sell 6 tickets for a charity ball. But I haven't had much luck. Would you like a couple?" A sudden idea flashed into Nancy's mind at her friend's words. "Helen," she said excitedly, "I'll buy 2 of your tickets and sell the rest for you." The girl stared in astonishment. "Why, that's a wonderful offer, Nance, but—" Nancy's eyes danced. "I know you think I've lost my mind. I really mean it, though. Please let me take the tickets. I can't tell you my reasons yet, except my cause is a worthy one." Helen, looking relieved but bewildered, handed over the tickets. "This is really a break for me," she said. "Now I can leave for my aunt's camp this evening as I'd hoped. It's at Moon Lake. I thought I'd never get off with those tickets unsold." Nancy smiled. "Have a grand time, Helen," she said. "How about coming along? It's not expensive, and there's room for lots more girls. We'd have loads of fun." "I'd love to," Nancy replied, "but right now I just can't get away." "Maybe you can make it later," Helen suggested. "If so, just zip on up. I'll be there for 2 weeks before the regular summer camp opens." The two friends chatted a little longer and then said goodbye. Nancy put the car away, then walked slowly toward her house, looking at the charity tickets in her hand. "These are my passport to the Topham stronghold." It was the following afternoon when Nancy approached the large, pretentious house belonging to the Tophams, bracing herself for what she realized would be a tiring interview. Nancy mounted the steps and rang the doorbell. "Here goes," she thought. "I must be subtle in this maneuver to keep from arousing the Tophams' suspicions." At that moment, a maid opened the door and with a condescending look waited for Nancy to state her mission. "Will you please tell Mrs. Topham that Nancy Drew is calling?" she requested. "I'm selling tickets for a charity dance. It's one of the most important functions of the year in River Heights," Nancy added impressively. It seemed ages to the young sleuth before the maid returned and said that Madame would see her. Nancy was ushered into the living room, which was so bizarre in its decor that she was startled. "Such an expensive hodgepodge," Nancy observed to herself sitting down. She glanced at the pink carpet, which to her clashed with the red window draperies, and at an indiscriminate assortment of period furniture mixed in with the modern. A haughty voice interrupted her thoughts. "Well, what do you want, Nancy?" Mrs. Topham had sailed grandly into the room and seated herself opposite Nancy. "I'm selling," she began pleasantly. "Oh, if you're selling things, I'm not interested," the woman broke in rudely. "I can't be handing out money to every solicitor who comes along." With difficulty, Nancy suppressed an angry retort to the cutting remark. "Mrs. Topham," she said evenly, "perhaps your maid didn't make it clear. I am selling tickets to a charity ball, which will be one of the loveliest affairs in River Heights this year." "Oh!" A slight change came over Mrs. Topham's face. Nancy sensed that her words had struck a responsive chord. The woman was well known for her aspirations to be accepted by the families in River Heights. "Well," to Nancy's dismay, Mrs. Topham's response was cut off by the arrival of Ada and Isabel. The sisters entered the room, but at first did not notice Nancy's presence. They were intently carrying on a disgruntled conversation. "Really?" Ada was complaining. "I'm positive that woman snubbed us deliberately." Then she and Isabel caught sight of Nancy and stopped short. They stared coldly at the visitor. "What are you doing here?" Isabel asked with a patronizing air. Mrs. Topham answered her daughter's question. "Nancy is selling tickets to a charity dance, dear. It's to be a very important affair, and I think it will be beneficial for us to be present." Isabel tossed her head disdainfully. "Don't waste your money, Mother." "Isabel's right," Ada chimed in. "We don't want to go to a ball that just anybody can go to. We only attend the most exclusive affairs." "Absolutely," Isabel declared in her haughtiest tone. "After all, Ada and I are very particular about the people we choose to meet." Mrs. Topham hesitated, evidently influenced by her daughter's argument. Nancy's heart sank, and she feared that her cause was lost. She fully realized that Ada and Isabel would stay away from the dance just to spite her. She debated what her next move should be. Richard Topham walked into the living room. He was a thin man with sparse graying hair. His manner was rather nervous. Mrs. Topham perfunctorily introduced Nancy to her husband. "I gather you have some tickets to dispose of, Miss Drew?" he said without ceremony. "How many?" "Why, 4, Nancy replied in some surprise. "I'll take them all." Mr. Topham opened his wallet with a flourish and drew out a $100 bill. "Here you are. Keep the change for your charity." His daughters gasped and his wife explained, "Richard, have you lost your senses? All that money?" "Listen," Mr. Topham reported bluntly, "this donation will entitle us to have our names in the programs as patrons." With this remark, he slumped into a chair and buried himself in the financial section of the newspaper. His family stared at one another, but they knew that the matter was closed. They never dared disturb him when he was absorbed in the stock market reports. Nancy arose reluctantly. She still had not accomplished her real purpose of the visit, but she had no excuse for prolonging her stay. How would she find out about the Crowley clock? Was it the one on the mantelpiece? I must be going, she said. Looking at her wristwatch, she pretended that it had stopped and began to wind it. What time is it, please? There's a clock right in front of you on the mantel, Ada said sharply. Nancy looked at the timepiece. So there is, she remarked casually. Is it an heirloom? Perhaps the old Crowley clock I've heard so much about? Mrs. Topham looked down her nose. I should say not. This is a far more expensive one. Isabel also rose to Nancy's bait. Cousin Josiah's old clock was a monstrosity. We wouldn't even have it cluttering up the attic. Nancy's hopes waned, but she asked quickly, Oh, so then you sold it? No, Ada spoke up. Who'd give any money for that piece of junk? We sent it up to our bungalow at Moon Lake. Moon Lake. The words hit Nancy like a thunderbolt. Not only had the Topham girl given Nancy the very information she sought, but Helen Corning's invitation to the camp had provided a valid reason for the visit to the resort. Now, if only she could figure out how to see the old clock. As if Ada had read the visitor's thoughts, she said airily, We have some really fine pieces up at the cottage, Nancy. If you ever get up that way, you should drop in and see them. The caretaker will show you around. Thank you very much for everything, Nancy said, trying hard to conceal her excitement. As the door closed behind her, Nancy grinned in anticipation. What luck, she told herself. Moon Lake, here I come.